Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Well-Placed Faith radio broadcast. During the next hour, during our time together, we're going to continue looking into Paul's wonderful book of Galatians. I am Paul Trask. Before we jump into some new territory in Galatians today, though, I think it might be helpful for us to spend a few minutes to just recap what we have learned so far during our messages regarding this wonderful book of Galatians. You will recall from prior broadcasts that in Acts chapter 13 and chapter 14, Paul and Barnabas were commissioned and sent out from the church in Syrian Antioch to go and travel and spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so they did. This is commonly referred to as Paul's first missionary journey. He and Barnabas went on an extensive trip over an extended period of time, and they traveled through the region of Galatia, which is today southeastern Turkey. And they planted a number of churches and had great success. They planted churches in towns like Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, and the Antioch, which is in Pisidia. When they had concluded this tour of duty, they decided to retrace their steps and come back to the church which had initially commissioned them for this work, the church which is in Antioch in Syria. After they had been back in Antioch for some period of time, though, they started getting some disturbing news. What they found out was that some troublemakers, some Judaizers from the church in Jerusalem, claiming authority, were troubling the early converts in Galatia. Well, once Paul got wind of what was going on and how these people were actually causing trouble for these early converts, he was angry. And so he sat down and penned the letter that we're going through now, this letter to the churches in Galatia. Those troublemakers from Jerusalem were disparaging Paul. They were disparaging his apostleship, and consequently, they were disparaging his message as being defective. And they were claiming to have the real authority from Christian headquarters in Jerusalem, and consequently, they were saying that they alone had the proper authorized message. Well, and so the Galatian Christians would now have to first become Jewish in order to continue being considered as Christians. These troublemaking Judaizers from Jerusalem were telling these early Christians that they only thought they were Christian. They couldn't really be Christian or continue being viewed as Christian until they were circumcised, began keeping all the various dietary restrictions under the Mosaic law, keeping kosher, and keeping the Jewish Sabbath, among a myriad of other restrictions and regulations under the Mosaic law. Well, the early Christian converts in Galatia were really being quite troubled and burdened by all of this talk. And so Paul decides he's going to sit down and pen this letter to set things straight. And he decides in this letter to take on these troublemakers from Jerusalem. He's going to take them on head on. He begins the letter by defending his apostleship. After all, Paul had been commissioned directly by Jesus Christ. And he defends his message, too. This was not a message that he received from any man or set of men, nor was he commissioned by any man or set of men to preach the gospel, but rather the gospel he was preaching he received directly from Jesus Christ. Later on in chapter 1, he also explains to these Galatian Christians, yet again, how he had jettisoned his own Jewish pedigree, all of his cultural background and experience, his network of relationships, and his high standing as a budding new up-and-comer leader for Judaism, things that other men would have given their eye teeth to have had. Paul was willing to throw it all away for the sake of knowing his Savior, Jesus Christ alone, and for knowing his gospel alone. And so as Paul opens up his letter to these Galatian Christians, he made a declaration of independence. He declared himself independent of the Jerusalem church. He was not reliant on them, nor did he look to them as being superior. He was not subordinate to them. He was not going to be controlled by them. On the contrary, he is suggesting that he is altogether equal with them in preaching his gospel to these Gentile converts in Galatia. So after he had declared his independence and made his Gentile Christian believers once again understand how much he had given up for this message, he then went on to explain that while he was independent of the Jerusalem church, he certainly knew them and they knew him. And so he goes into some extensive discussion about two different occasions upon which he visited Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem, and the leaders in Jerusalem. And he walked away from both experiences, and he's telling his Galatian listeners, he's telling them that these leaders really did not alter his gospel message at all. They did not see his gospel message as being defective or deficient in any way, nor did they seek to supplement or add to what Paul was already preaching as the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in the final analysis, they came to a gentleman's agreement. They actually gave Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship from Jerusalem and told them that they fully endorsed Paul and Barnabas' mission to the Gentile world, while they in Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John, focused on Jews. So all of that is to refresh our memory and kind of bring us up to speed on what we've been doing in prior messages regarding Galatians. And so now we're ready to jump into some new material. Now, we've been saying all along that Galatians is Paul's angry letter. Well, today we're going to look at an ugly confrontation in Galatians, and we're going to see just how angry Paul can be. So we're going to start off today by reading chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the superstition group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. Well, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile, and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" Well, I think you can see by now what I'm talking about in terms of Galatians being Paul's angry letter. I think you can find very few other places in all of the New Testament where you find such a straightforward confrontation between two Christians, let alone two leaders and two apostles in Christ. Now, those of you who have been listening carefully at this point may ask a very good and a very astute question. Why was Peter even in Antioch? His mission was to the Jews, and Antioch was a center for Gentile Christianity. You will recall from last week, we read in chapter 2, where they had made an agreement among themselves, the leaders in Jerusalem versus Paul and Barnabas, to divide up and move into different realms. Paul and Barnabas to the Gentile world, Peter, James, and John to the Jewish world. So I'm going to read now from Galatians 2, verses 6 through 9, where Paul says, "Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. For God, who was at work in the ministry of Peter as an apostle to the Jews, was also at work in my ministry as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed, we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the Jews." And so the logical question is, since Peter, James, and John had agreed that they would focus on Jewish believers, what would have brought Peter to Antioch to begin with? Well, I have an idea that I would like to share with you. This is very well what may have happened and led to his arrival in Antioch. You'll remember from a few weeks ago, we talked about Peter's going to a centurion home, a centurion by the name of Cornelius, where the Lord had orchestrated a wonderful meeting between the law-observant Peter and the entourage with him, and the Gentile Cornelius and his family and friends together with him. And the Lord completely converted Cornelius and everybody that was in his house that day. They were baptized in the Holy Spirit, just like the early disciples had been on the day of Pentecost. And it was a tremendously miraculous experience, orchestrated every detail by the Lord God Almighty himself. Peter was initially slow to engage in that activity because he complained to the Lord that he was a law-observant Jew and that he should not engage in this kind of unclean activity. The Lord convinced him it was okay, and so he went ahead and did it. Well, and so he stayed with Cornelius in Cornelius' own house for a few days and ate this unclean food and so forth with Cornelius. And so when Peter got back to Jerusalem, the church called him on the carpet and said, just what do you think you're doing? You went into this Gentile house, you ate their food, you hung out with them, and actually stayed in that same house. How can you do that? And so Peter rehearsed the entire story, explaining in detail how the Lord God had actually orchestrated the entire affair and how he had actually baptized Cornelius and his entire entourage in the Holy Spirit, just like they had been on the day of Pentecost. And so for the time being, the church in Jerusalem acquiesced to Peter's experience and said that that was going to be okay. But you'll notice also from what we talked about in prior weeks that it was that experience with Cornelius that cost Peter his role of leadership in the Jerusalem church. He is never spoken about or regarded as the leader of the Jerusalem church from that moment forward. And so it's the 10th chapter of Acts that tells us about Peter's meeting with Cornelius. Chapter 11 explains what happened when Peter got back into town and was called onto the carpet by the Jerusalem church. And in the very next chapter, chapter 12 of Acts, Peter finds himself imprisoned. King Herod had been persecuting the church in Jerusalem, and in the process he had killed John's brother James. You know, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. James was killed. Well, when Herod did this, the Jews cheered, and they were so thrilled that he decided to round up Peter as well, and he scheduled him for a public trial after Passover, which likely would have resulted in his death. So the night before his scheduled trial, however, God sent an angel to free Peter from prison. While Peter was awaiting trial, he had been under very heavy guard. He was sleeping between two soldiers, bound not with one chain, but with two chains. In the middle of the night, this angel came into the prison, and he woke Peter up. He released his chains and told Peter to get dressed. Once Peter got his clothes on, the angel led him past two other soldiers who had been positioned to stand guard, and then the angel opened up the iron gate leading out into the city. Well, the gate opened automatically, as though it were an electronic gate opened by remote control. Miraculous. While all this was going on, Peter was still half asleep. Everything had happened so fast he couldn't completely take in what was actually transpiring. Well, at the same time, a group of his fellow Christians were gathered together praying for Peter. So when Peter became alert enough to figure out what had just happened, he made his way to the house where this group of Christians were praying. So get this. These people were actually praying for Peter, but when he knocks on their door, they can't believe it's actually him, and they don't let him in. Well, finally, they opened the door, and they were amazed that the Lord had miraculously set him free. Well, Peter was not just a little bit amazed himself, and so he didn't risk pushing his luck by staying in town. So after he checked in with the church there in the middle of the night, we are told that, quote, he left for another place. I believe that there's a very good chance that that other place was Antioch, which presents the incident that we're now reading about in Galatians. Antioch was the first major center of Gentile Christianity. Remember, this was the church, the Gentile church, which sent Paul and Barnabas off on their first Gentile mission. Now, Peter had just gotten into hot water in Jerusalem because he had fraternized with Gentile Cornelius and his entire household, and he'd actually stayed in this unclean household for a few days, even eating their non-kosher food. Well, this was scandalous, and it had ended up jeopardizing his life. He wasn't about ready to stick around in town to figure out what else awaited him at the hands of Herod, so he got out of town. Now, it's important to know that during this time frame that there was a tremendous nationalistic movement within the nation of Israel. The Jews were chafing under Roman occupation, and they were really quite eager to throw off that yoke of occupation and regain their national sovereignty again. And so in this nationalistic movement, they were zealous about their national identity and maintaining a unified front in the face of this Roman occupation. Therefore, for any Jew to abandon their national identity would be equivalent to treason. We're so accustomed in our day and time for church and government to operate in two different realms that it's hard for us to understand the religious environment of the first century. Separation of church and state was an absolutely foreign concept to them. Church was state. State was church. And so the Mosaic Law was not only a religious observance, it became their national civil law as well, and a matter of their national identity and a matter of their national unity as a people. And so to stop observing the Mosaic Law for a Jew was the equivalent of treason, and they were being hunted down and dealt with severely. And so Jerusalem had become an unsafe place for any Jew who was not zealously keeping their nationalistic Mosaic Law. So when he was released from prison, I think there's a very high likelihood that Peter sought out a place where there were other Christians, but also a place where his life would not be in constant jeopardy. And so this background may help us understand exactly why Peter was even in Antioch to begin with, and it may also help explain why he was ultra-sensitive to these inspectors who had come from Jerusalem to check things out in Antioch. He, like Paul, was probably concerned about a schism in the church, a separation or an alienation between Gentile Christianity and that which existed in Jerusalem. Chances are he was concerned for his own life, and his future visits to and association with the Jerusalem church would be in jeopardy if word got back to the headquarters that he was continuing to blow off the Mosaic Law. However, as Paul makes abundantly clear, he feels that Peter was going about these concerns in all the wrong way. So, why do you think the Apostle Paul was so upset with what Peter was doing? So upset that he would rebuke him in public? Well, Peter was an established leader. Before his run-in, before his experience with Cornelius, and his subsequent calling on the carpet at the Jerusalem church when he got back into town, Peter had been the undisputed leader of the Jerusalem church. And so he had a reputation. People in Antioch knew that, Gentiles as well as Jews. And so by proxy, he was being viewed as representing the Jerusalem church. His actions, therefore, were being interpreted as actions that were in keeping with the Jerusalem church. And because of Peter's influence and his high-ranking authority, even Barnabas was moving along with what Paul calls hypocrisy. Barnabas was Paul's very own missionary buddy. These guys had traveled extensively and had been comrades in arms as they endured hardship and ill treatment wherever they went in Galatia, as they had labored and planted churches and preached the gospel. Barnabas, his own missionary companion, was being led astray by Peter, who was representing the Jerusalem church. In fact, all of the Jewish Christians there in Antioch were following Peter's lead. Well, Paul knew that because of this hypocrisy on the part of the Jews, the work there in Antioch was being jeopardized. New believers were beginning to feel that faith was not enough. Well, they now also had to become Jewish, or else they couldn't be considered Christians by the headquarters, the acknowledged, presumed headquarters of Christianity, Jerusalem. Also, Paul felt that this hypocrisy and word getting back to these churches in Galatia would not only jeopardize the work in Antioch itself, but would also jeopardize their work in Galatia, since word was beginning to get back to them about what was happening in Antioch. The integrity of the gospel, especially among Gentiles, was seriously at risk. And so not only were Paul's early converts being troubled by troublemakers from Jerusalem, now you had the presumed leader of the Jerusalem church coming to Antioch itself and acting in a hypocritical way, which it was endangering the work of the Gentile mission among Gentiles. And so Paul decided he'd had enough. This has gone far enough. We're going to deal with it. We're going to deal with it here. We're going to deal with it now. We're going to deal with it personally, and we're going to do it publicly. In Paul's angry response to Peter's behavior, I'd like to have us focus today on two words. One is condemnation, the other is hypocrisy. In the New International Version, which I read earlier, Paul says, "When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong." Well, that's a little bit too mild. The underlying Greek has more of a sense of a condemnation, and so the New American Standard Bible actually has it better. It says, I opposed Peter to his face because he stood condemned. And that is actually more faithful to the seriousness implied in the underlying Greek word. Peter, by his own behavior, which was public and easily discerned, Peter's own behavior had betrayed him, and so his behavior had indicted himself, and he stood now condemned. And he now needed then, therefore, to be held accountable for that sin. Well, I hope you can appreciate how serious a charge this is against a fellow apostle. But the integrity of the gospel was hanging in the balance, and so Paul did not do this lightly. The other word that I'd like to have us focus on during our time together is the word hypocrisy. This is down in verse 13, where Paul observes that other Jews there in Antioch were joining Peter in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. His old missionary traveling buddy was being carried away with that same hypocrisy. The Greek word translated hypocrisy here comes directly from Greek theater for an actor who is merely playing a part, reading a script, acting in a role. But it's not a genuine expression of the person's character or personality. Well, it's like commercials or movies today. We see actors or actresses that we like, and we see them in commercials. We see a sports figure that we like, and they're promoting breakfast cereal or toothpaste or deodorant or whatever it is they happen to be portraying. These people are merely filling a role. They're not being genuine or sincere, and yet it's interesting that we attribute sincerity to them, even though they're just play acting a role. They're play acting. Same thing is true in movies, such that even when our favorite movie star is playing in a role, we kind of impute sincerity to this person, even though they're just reading a script and fulfilling a role. We begin seeing them as being genuine in a role that they're merely play acting at. It's really fraudulent at its core. And yet that is what Paul is saying that Peter was doing by play acting with this law-keeping stuff based on people coming from Jerusalem to observe their behavior. And so Paul is accusing Peter of play acting, that he was not really being sincere or genuine. He knew better. He didn't really believe in what he was doing, but he was playing along with it, in order to appease these people who had come from Jerusalem. Shame on you, Peter. What an absolutely atrocious example you're setting for these Gentile converts in Antioch. Now, Peter's withdrawal from the Gentiles and his alignment with the Jews from Jerusalem had been kind of a slow and a little bit of a gradual course of action on Peter's part. Peter was hoping that this shift or change in his habits would fly under the radar and really wouldn't be noticed to anybody. Well, and so Paul here finally decided to blow Peter's cover wide open. His sin had been in the public arena, and so Paul decided that the rebuke would be in public too. Paul is not going to play nice with a serious blow to what he knew to be the truth of the gospel. And so here's what's important for us to understand in all of this. Paul is rehearsing this confrontation at Antioch for the benefit of his Galatian churches, to help them understand the hypocrisy of the whole matter and to defend the pure gospel which these very Galatian Christians had once accepted and had been blessed in. So what is Paul's bottom line for his churches in Galatia? It's just this. His message to the churches in Galatia is that these Jewish troublemakers which are now operating in Galatia were on no better standing than those who were in Antioch. And as Paul didn't give in to them for a moment in Antioch, but rather took a hard stand for the pure gospel, so the Galatian Christians should also take a hard stand and get rid of those corrupting influence of these troublemakers who were claiming authority from Jerusalem. We're going to shift gears now, and we're going to take a look at the other aspect of what happened here during this incident in Antioch. This passage is like a two-sided coin. We've been looking at the face of the coin, which are the theological implications of what was going on here in Antioch. But like a two-sided coin, there's another side. And we're going to flip that coin over now and look at the other side of the issues which were going on in this incident. There are actually a cluster of issues, and they have to do with behavioral, moral, and ethical issues. Issues like character, integrity, influence, peer pressure, and group think. These are not abstract theories, but they are real-world realities, and they have profound ramifications. In the story presented to us by Paul here in Antioch, we have a cascading negative influence. First, initiated by the Judaizers from Jerusalem. They, of course, impacted the former leader of their organization, Peter. He, in turn, impacted Barnabas, Paul's traveling and evangelization buddy. And then, based on the example of Peter and Barnabas, all the other Jews in Antioch joined in following this example of hypocrisy. They were jeopardizing the truth of the gospel and the welfare of Gentile Christians, not only in Antioch and in Galatia, but in fact, they had been jeopardizing the success of the entire Gentile mission. In the face of this hypocrisy, it was Paul alone who stood up as a whistleblower, using a term that's popular today, primarily in the business and political arena. Paul alone stood up as a whistleblower, and he stemmed the tide. Paul alone called out their fraudulent, detrimental behavior. Paul alone had convictions, and he had the backbone to stand up for them. If we treat this passage of Scripture as only theological, and if we miss the moral and ethical lessons here, well, we've missed the boat. Though we may not want to take responsibility for this, we influence people, whether we want to influence them or whether we don't. People are watching. Our children, our spouses, our workmates in the workplace, other church members, and yes, non-Christians. Whether you mean to or whether you don't, you are in fact a witness for Christ. The only question is just what kind of witness are you? Mother Teresa once said that we should take every advantage of every opportunity to witness for Christ, and if necessary, we should even use words. Sometimes our actions as Christians actually speak louder than our words. Actually, sometimes our actions eclipse whatever we say with words. How many times have I had non-Christians tell me that they've turned away from Christ and the church because they see Christians acting hypocritically? We're talking about powerful cluster of behaviors here: character, integrity, influence, peer pressure, group think. We're going to take a few minutes now and we're going to examine how this works in the real world, and we're going to bring it out of the first century, and we're going to bring it out of Antioch and out of Galatia, and we're going to take the identical cluster of issues that were at work in Antioch, and we're going to apply them to today's world. In the early 2000s, you may recall that there were a number of corporate scandals. The most notable one was Enron, but there were others: WorldCom, Adelphia. In fact, there were scores of business and financial frauds all over the country. They were front page news. They were on the evening news. They were in the publications. They were in everybody's forethought. And I want you to know that not one of these financial or business frauds was the work of a single person. You cannot do the kinds of things that Enron did, or WorldCom, or Adelphia, or anybody else. You can't do that as one person. It requires collusion. It requires teamwork. A number of significant people have to go along to advance their careers or their pocketbooks. People of influence start the evil trend, but they solicit the cooperation, and they gain the cooperation of a significant number of other important people in order to achieve these devastating results. I'm an accountant. I'm a retired CPA. I used to work for a national accounting firm, and in that arena, the firm of Arthur Andersen used to be the blue chip accounting firm in all the world. They were at the top of the heap. Yet because of their action, because of their complicity in the Enron failure, they went out of business. They had to liquidate the partnership and cease to exist. And from my professional background, this kind of thing was absolutely unthinkable, unheard of. And it all happened because they cooperated with evil. They were an active participant, and they allowed themselves to be influenced by evil and for evil. And that impacted a number of very innocent people that put Arthur Andersen on their resume for a few years. People were wondering, what did you do while you were at Arthur Andersen? And a number of people lost millions of dollars of their investment money because of all these business failures. And virtually none of these conspiracies, none of these frauds, none of these failures was the work of a single individual. It took a team. It took a team of people who had been convinced that this is what they needed to do to appease, to please, to advance their careers, or to advance their pocketbooks. So here's another real-world example. This one, in fact, is one that I was involved with personally. Some years ago, I was controller for a division of a chip manufacturer in Silicon Valley out in Santa Clara, California. We had been acquired by a European company, and we had an internal bonus program which was really quite lucrative, and it was really quite nice to be a member of that bonus program. And we had had an absolutely outstanding year. We had made a tremendous amount of money as a company. And so, left unchecked, that would have rewarded the president of our company and made him the highest paid person, not only in our company, but of the parent company, who was in Europe. And the CFO could not let that happen because it might have cost the president his job. And so he went on a campaign to actually cook the books. And he came to me asking for help, and he showed me what their existing income was, and that they needed to cook the books, basically, and reduce that income substantially in order to save the job of the president. Well, I told him that I wasn't going to participate in that, and that I was not going to play ball with that. But he was able to convince a number of other people around the company to play ball with this program, and when they published their results for the year, it came in to the dollar, what he had showed me on that piece of paper in my office one day. Even though I didn't play ball, a number of other of my peers around the company did play ball, and he was able to distort the earnings of the company and short the rest of us our bonuses in order to save the president of the company from embarrassment at the parent company level. And he did that through a practice which is commonly called cooking the books, intentionally and deliberately distorting financial results to achieve an agenda. Now, I'm not telling you that story or any of the stories yet to come as a matter of self-promotion. I am just as human and fallible as any other human on the planet. Just ask my wife. I'm telling you these stories to bring down to real-world terms these issues of character and integrity, peer pressure, groupthink, all that stuff that was going on in Amazon is happening today. It's happening all around us, and oftentimes with dire consequences. So some years later, I worked with a gentleman in a startup situation, and I discovered that he was conducting his business fraudulently. And I decided that I needed to alert some of the members that he was bringing on, some of the other, executives that he was bringing on to promote this business, and let them know about the fraud and deception which had already taken place, much of which was very seriously illegal. And I remember, and these men were Christians, okay, and they ended up lending their reputation. And people ended up investing in this business several $1 million. And I remember one of them telling me, as I was explaining the serious legal and criminal consequences of what had been engaged in, across my desk he said to me, well, Paul, if this person goes down, the person who had formed the company, if this person goes down, maybe all of this will fall to us. Well, inevitably, predictably, this company failed. The Securities and Exchange Commission came in and substantially restricted what they could do, and predictably, they failed. And they took down a number of people with them, and several thousand people lost virtually millions of dollars. And I remember that guy that sat across the desk and told me that a Christian leader, a high-profile Christian leader here locally, told me maybe this would fall to us. I ended up seeing him on the evening news being indicted by a grand jury for fraud. But because he had lent his reputation and his credibility to this fraudulent enterprise, many people invested their hard-earned money. Widows and orphans, the very people that the securities laws were designed to protect, they ended up investing in this operation, and most of them lost virtually all of their money. Literally millions of dollars were lost. Whether we want to or whether we don't, we influence people and we lend credibility to what we choose to engage in. This next story is very deeply personal for me and very painful at the same time. Some years ago, I became the chief financial officer for a large, high-profile Christian ministry in Los Angeles. Shortly after I hired on, I had never worked in a professional capacity for a Christian ministry like this. And so it took a while for me to kind of figure out the levers and gears and how that industry and how nonprofits worked. I had always, before and since, spent my life working primarily with large public corporations, and I'd never worked for a small nonprofit, a comparatively small nonprofit like this. And I discovered that they were violating Christian ethics. There is a group called the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. Many of the fundraising appeals that you get in the mail have that little stamp somewhere on the appeals indicating that this so-called Christian oversight body had held the organization to very strict standards. Well, the ECFA, this Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, has 7 standards of fundraising to treat their donors with ethics, with good moral ethic responsibility. Shortly after I joined this organization, I wrote a white paper to the president indicating that our particular organization was in blatant violation of 4 out of the 7 standards. And they were a charter member of the ECFA. Being relatively new on the job and in this organization, blowing the whistle like that with my white paper was really the last thing I wanted to do, but I was compelled to maintain my own personal integrity. I had to alert management to the fact that they were violating these standards. Well, that created a fair amount of hubbub, and I was, in effect, in retrospect, I was placated for about a year, saying that they were going to clean up the way they did business. They were going to revise their fundraising practices and their accounting practices to actually comply with these standards. And so I went about my business and took care of my part of the organization for the better part of the next year. But when I found the next fundraising season to come out, I found them doing the same things. And so I ultimately confronted the director of development who had responsibility for these practices, and he was a former pastor and a high-profile Christian leader. And he told me, he said, you know, Paul, we took a look at this and we decided that we could not afford to comply with these standards. We're just barely meeting our budget now, and if we complied with those standards, we couldn't continue to operate our organization. Oh my, what a stunning confession by a Christian leader. In other words, if you flip what he said around, he said he was really saying the only way we can continue this operation was through lies, deceit, fraud, and manipulation. That's the only way that we can continue operating. But it's for a good cause. I mean, we're helping people, we're doing Christian ministry on the ministry end of it. And so the rationale was, well, since it's for a good cause, we can do whatever we want to do in the back office. We can operate however we choose to in the back office, as long as it's for a good cause. I remember talking to the president about this very thing one day, and I ended up telling this man, I said, listen, God does not need you. God does not need me. God is perfectly capable of doing his work all by himself. What he wants from us is faithful obedience and integrity, and that's the way that we need to be running this operation. We're a Christian organization, and we need to be operating cleaner and better than anybody out there, and we're not doing it. Well, after I got placated for the year and when I figured out that they were not going to change their stripes, I ended up resigning in disgust. And later that same year, the president with whom I'd had that conversation dropped dead. And he was a young man in his early 40s. I also, before I resigned, I attended an ECFA conference, and I brought this issue and the flagrant violations that my organization was presently engaged in. I brought it to their attention officially and formally. They didn't lift a finger to sanction or to do anything else regarding the dire violation of their own standards that my organization was involved in. So, these were Christians too, and they were holding themselves out as watchdogs, guardians of integrity among Christian ministries. Probably not. Now, I want you to know that I'm sorry to have to express all of this, dirty laundry by Christian ministries, by Christians and Christian ministries. I take no pleasure in it. In fact, having to be a part of this, having to take a stand against it, having to resign, And to come to the realization that this is really fairly widespread has been one of the greatest disappointments of my life. I feel very disillusioned by Christians who are operating on a public, oftentimes a national platform. Oh my, it breaks my heart to have to alert you to this, but the reality is it's real. People get influenced. They get in their minds that the end is worth the means, and they are willing to go along with corruption and distortion of ethics and morality, all that's good and holy, because they convince themselves that it's for a good cause and that it's worth it in some way. That's exactly what Paul was addressing in Antioch. Peter, Barnabas, the other Jews who were influenced and led astray were acting fraudulently, and Paul called them on it. Well, I'm not done. I've got some other things to relate to you, and this time it relates even to the pulpit. My brother-in-law attended a Southern Baptist church here in our region and was friends with the pastor. They would have lunch together. And so my brother-in-law, in asking the pastor one day at lunch about his personal views on some selected theological and biblical topics, the pastor turned and said to him, "You know, I have my own personal views, but I'm being paid to promote the statement of faith of our denomination and of our particular church." Well, that's quite a stunning revelation. So in other words, when this guy stands up in the pulpit, you don't know whether he's being genuine and sincere about what he is promoting regarding the Bible or theology, or if he is merely being a hireling to promote a party line, which he may not, in fact, agree with. Wow. What a stunning confession by a man of God who stands in the pulpit influencing people, who does not support, condone, endorse, or agree with a particular statement of faith, but he's getting a paycheck to do that very thing, and so he's going to take the role of a hireling and promote that stuff, whether he believes it to be true or accurate or convincing or not. Simply incredible. So this next example is even closer to home to me personally. I know a pastor here in our region that we used to talk frequently. We don't do so anymore. But he and I were sharing our interest in a particular strand of theology, a series of books actually, regarding theology, and it was completely debunking the popular theology that is in his church's statement of faith. And he was getting really exuberant with me about his new discoveries and how he had changed his mind, how he was moving on from just the whole pre-trib dispensational package of nonsense. And yet his board of deacons wanted him to lead a series on eschatology about the end times. And so was he faithful and true then to his newfound understanding, the newfound truth that he had discovered? He had not only discovered truth, but he had also learned about error. So what did he end up doing? He ended up trotting out their statement of faith and trotting out the popular storyline about the pre-trib rapture. I actually went to hear him unpack some of this to a group of, large group of Christians. It was a pretty good-sized church. And so he had a large group of Christians sitting there as he unpacked stuff that he knew was no longer true because he was being paid to do it. He was expected to do it. At one point he confessed to me, he said, if I was putting our statement of faith together today, I would not include these various dispensational passages in the statement of faith, but it's already there. And so I'm constrained to promote it. So if somebody makes an error and puts it in a statement of faith, that pastor, and I'm sure many others, even Christians, feel compelled to perpetuate that error even after they discover the fact that it's wrong. I simply cannot respect what this pastor and former friend of mine chose to do within his congregation. He chose expediency over truth. He simply lacked the moral courage to stand by his convictions and to help lead his church in a better direction. He allowed them to influence him. He was no longer influencing them for good. He was merely influencing them to continue perpetuating an error. That's not what leaders do. That's especially not what courageous Christian leaders should be doing. I want to say again that I take no joy in exposing these moral and spiritual failures among Christians, but it's real and it's serious. And silence is consent. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. American Christianity is in trouble. The Apostle Paul had convictions. He had a backbone, and he was willing to take a bold stand for the truth when no one else was willing to stand with him, and by so doing he saved God's mission to the Gentiles from corruption. How about you? Do you have convictions? Do you have a backbone? Are you willing to take a stand for truth and for what's right in the workplace, in our culture, in the church? So let me ask you this question in closing. If you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Well, my friends, we're out of time for today, but I hope that you'll join us again next week as we continue our look at the courageous Apostle Paul and his letter to the churches of Galatia.